right, we are going to get started. And again, today, like yesterday, I'm going to start with a PowerPoint and then we'll do the movement. Afterwards, it's going to be a very strict time schedule now that I have some alarms set to make sure I don't go over. So I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint and let's see, where are we? Here we go. Okay, not that one. Okay, this one, and then let's go to present. Okay, move this out of the way-ish. So this is session 2, and the lecture is how somatics can help to reduce tension or pain. And if you are anything like me as a teacher, that is one of the usually most prominent reasons students come to us for yoga and movement and help. So I'm going to see, let's go to the next slide. Oops, too far. Okay, before we get into the objectives for today, I always like to ask, generally when I teach live, I do it in the same format. There's 4 3-hour workshops or sessions. And I am a learner, I'm a nerd. I love taking continuing ed. And I get really excited and I always feel like, oh my gosh, you know, I wanna teach everything I just learned in that last workshop on Monday, which isn't going to happen. That's not how learning happens. So then I bring it back down and I think, okay, what's one thing I learned in the last workshop or session that I want to remember? So I want you to just take a moment, just a minute or so, and think about if there's one thing you learned in the last session that you definitely want to remember. And you can just write that in the chat box and I will take a look. Let's see. Stop share. There we go. And chat. Okay. And let's see where we are. Okay, here we go. All right, so pandiculation from Andy and constraints and feathering. Yes, pandiculation. Somatics is training the brain. Yes, these are all really, I think, key ideas that will help you understand the difference between somatics and practicing asana and why one is not better than the other. They're just different and they're highly complementary. Yes, Maud says, somatics is more about guidance and inquiry as opposed to instruction. And again, same thing, one is not good or bad, or better or worse, but it's really nice, I think, to introduce your students to both styles of learning because we need structure, but then we also need to be empowered to make decisions for ourselves about how we move our body. So I think it's a really, wonderful way to start to do little bits of it. If your students are really used to being told exactly where to put every body part all the time through the whole class, to start to transition them a little bit into giving them more autonomy and choice. Okay, yes, new ways of cueing. Remembering to stop and observe, yes. And breaking down movement into its smallest component parts, yes. So today, and I mean, every class that I teach, but the 2 movement classes we're gonna do today, we're gonna start small and then get bigger. And how that would apply to a private session that I think is so wonderful is when you start small and then you go bigger. As you go bigger and the challenge increases in a private session, there's a dialogue, there's a conversation. And so you can look at that one person's facial expressions and be like, how's this feeling? Are you doing okay? Should we change gears? In a group class, it's group class, so we've got that continuum. and that trajectory, and there's the empowerment of the student to make the decision, well, maybe I should stick with the thing we're doing right now instead of going to the next thing, but still having an option of something to do. Okay, yes, teaching students to learn from themselves, yes. Yes, noticing how you feel, cool, all right. Yes, allowing movement rather than directing movement. You are so right, Andy. Yes, and interoception, Denise says, great to connect interoception with movement, because it's always, I would say, pretty commonly connected with meditation, but to connect it with movement is really nice. All right, so I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. Thank you all so much for sharing things that you learned, because that helps me. Okay, where am I? Share screen. There we go. And here we are. And present. I'm really getting the hang of this. So nice. All righty. So objectives for this lecture. I just have to move things out of the way so I can see what I'm reading. And I also want to make sure I pull this out so I don't forget my extra notes. All right, so objectives. Learn about pain science and how somatic movements may reduce tension and pain. Number 2, understand the difference between somatics and yoga. Learn about the stretch reflex versus pandiculation, and explore how somatics can enhance proprioception. So those are the 4 objectives for this lecture session. And we're going to start with an overview of pain science. And actually, I'm very curious. I'm going to go back again. Let's see, stop share. And put in the chat box, or no, I should probably do raise your hand. Raise your hand if you are familiar with pain science and have been exposed to it before, or you know what it is, you've learned something about it. Doesn't even have to be much, but just it's not brand new to you. Curious, raise your hand if it's not brand new to you. Because I always ask this question when I travel to teach, and it definitely depends. And some groups I teach, most everyone has learned about it a bit, and some it's completely new. And it's a really important thing to learn and understand. And so this will help me just get an idea. If you can raise your hand, let's see, I'm gonna go here. Wait, trying to find the way to see the raise the hands. Let's see if I go to chat box. Let's see, Andy or Serena, I forgot how I can see who's raising their hand.
Hi, Trina. So if you make sure that you can see the attendees on the right-hand side.
There we go. Okay, and okay, so I see participants. No, I just see there we go, attendees. Cool, okay, thank you. All right, yes, okay, I am seeing a lot of hands raised. So this isn't brand new. Good, good, good. Okay, 94 people. And all right, let's see, 35 of the 93 people have heard of it. Okay, wonderful. So let me go back to the PowerPoint, share the screen. And I got a little ahead. Okay, so an overview of pain science. Research is now suggesting that pain is less straightforward than what was originally theorized. So this new model of pain science, which actually isn't that new, it's been around for a good, well, I would say in the public sphere, maybe 10 to 15 years, longer than that, of course, in the research science sphere. The new model of pain science suggests that we take the following points into consideration when working with students who have pain. And of course, this is the caveat of, right, you're not a clinician unless you are, so scope of practice, but we do have students who come to take private lessons with us and classes, and they have pain. So number 1, pain often does not correlate with tissue damage. And that is especially the case with persistent pain versus acute pain. Persistent pain used to be called chronic pain. So pain that has been present for generally more than 3 months. Number two, pain is influenced or can be influenced by somatic, psychological, and social factors. And I think that seems really obvious to us, but we sometimes forget. We think like, oh, MRI or CT scan or X-ray said this, and this is why you have pain. And no, there's other factors that contribute. Number three, when pain is persistent, again, there's that word persistent rather than chronic, because in the next slide, I'll talk about nocebo and nocibic language. Chronic pain is nocibic language, and persistent pain infers that it's persistent, but it's possible for it to go away. When pain is persistent, there is a decreased correlation between tissue health and the amount of pain experienced, meaning the longer you've had pain, the less likely it is correlated to the health of your tissues, your muscles, your tendons, your ligaments. And then finally, number four, if the nervous system perceives a threat, someone might experience pain regardless of if the body is actually in danger of injury. So I'll say that one more time, and then I'm going to give you a reference that I think will be really helpful. So if the nervous system perceives a threat, someone might experience pain regardless of if the body is actually in danger of injury. So let me stop share, and I'm going to pull up this right here. So, no thanks. Skip ads. Open this. All right. So I guess because there's not sound on my computer, you're not going to hear this. I'm not going to play the whole thing. This is a 14-minute video. But what I do want you to do is to watch it at a later point if you haven't already. It's a TED Talk by Lorimer Moseley, and it's called Why Things Hurt. And so I'll kind of summarize it very briefly. I'm going to stop the screen share. Let's see. Close that. Okay, I'm back. But basically, he tells a story, and it's interesting because I taught in Adelaide, Australia, last year, this time. And that's where he's based out of, where he would always go hiking. And in Australia, they say in the bush. But I learned in the bush just means like anywhere you would go hiking. And he was walking along, and some twigs and branches hit the side of his leg. And he thought like, oh, like I felt that, like maybe it was thorny or something. And then he literally proceeded to walk like, I don't know, I think he said like another 15 steps. And he was like completely, fallen over, passed out. And what had happened was a snake had bit him. But, and it was a very could have been deadly. It was a, venomous, deadly snake bite. He survived. But he didn't feel any pain. He really thought that just some, brushed against him, and he just kept walking. So he has this experience, he survives. His PTSD, he finally gets over that enough to start hiking again. And so he starts to hike again, and he's walking through the bush, and he feels, some branch or whatever brush against him, and he's in excruciating pain. And that pain is from the brush, from the twigs. A snake didn't bite him, but because in his mind, he correlates that experience with the past experience, it's a story that discusses how pain is an output from our brain and not necessarily a reflection of what's happening in our tissues. So when I was doing physical therapy for my shoulder, this was probably back in 2011, I was really fortunate that my physical therapist, Sean Hampton, from ADI Rehab, thank you very much. If you're here in LA, he's awesome. I was in a persistent pain state. I had been in pain for over 3 months, meaning, and for me, it was like, I had some carpal tunnel, my shoulder hurt, but it was also like, neck pain, jaw pain. It was basically from my ear all the way down to my right hand. It was undifferentiated. There was a lot of smudging, which meant like I couldn't sense the areas from my right side of my neck to my right hand because of how long I'd been in pain. So he lent me this book, which is called Explain Pain. And it's by Lorimer Moseley. So let's see if I go into, should I type that in the chat box? I haven't done this yet.
Yes, Trina, we were going to ask you to do that.
Wonderful. Okay, so it's called Explain Pain, and it's by Lorimer Moseley. And it's mostly pictures. It's like this artist beautifully paints these pictures, and it's like super hardcore, nerdy pain science, but completely dumbed down in the best kind of way for the general public. And it was a game changer for me because I realized that my tissues had healed by that point, but I was just in this loop of from when the pain was acute. And that loop just kept going. And I knew I had to gain more proprioception through movement, through progressive loading to eventually stop that loop to get out of that persistent pain cycle. So yes, when I first started with PT with Sean, it was just, okay, let's get you out of that like acute pain. So the e-stim, the ice, the heat, some hands-on stuff. But after things had calmed down, it was time to get to work and to start moving and loading and building new neuromuscular connections. So I want to get too off track with that, but those two things I highly recommend. The third thing is the Explain Pain book is expensive. It's $80. And so Lorimer Moseley has a free PDF you can download, but so does Gregory Lehman. And I mentioned Gregory Lehman yesterday. I'll type his name in. Greg, Lehman. And Greg Lehman has, no, put the link for the PDF that I always offer up to my students and clients. Let's see, Explain Pain, weightlifting. Here we go. It is right here. Let me copy paste. And C and Plan B. And it is kind of like the free version of the Explain Pain book from Lorimer Moseley. So it's a free download. And if you do donate, the money goes to research on pain science. Okay, so here we are. What is a nocebo effect? A nocebo effect is when psychological or psychosomatic factors, such as negative expectations of a diagnosis or fear of injury based on cueing, result in someone experiencing more pain. So let me just check my notes to make sure. Okay, yeah, so I have an example of a nocebic cue. And I cued all of these things. I was a fear-mongering cue person for many years because I didn't know what I know now. So, I would say like, make sure you protract your shoulder blades in a plank to protect your shoulders. Or, say we were doing a back bend, I would say, engage your abs to protect your back. And when we speak in that way, which is the technical term is nocebic language, we induce fear, which then is going to make somebody more likely to experience pain. And also have fear of movement, which we know highly correlates to pain. So we can give these same cues, but we just don't need to say, do this to protect that, or do this so that you don't hurt this thing. so let's see, let me go back to the screen share. Yeah, and so I'm sure many of you have had students who've come to you. Probably shouldn't screen share, I should go back. This is hard. Yesterday I didn't, I kept the thing up too long, and now I'm trying to remember not to, but it's definitely challenging because I'm a horrible multitasker. But what I was gonna say is, I'm pausing. Is that we don't want our students to be afraid of moving. And the best way we can help them to not be afraid of moving is to work with them privately, one-on-one, and have a conversation. So that when they do feel pain, we can really talk about it and strategize. Whereas in a group class, that conversation can't happen. But at least in a group class, if we don't cue in a fear-mongering way, I think we will be able to help our students feel more empowered to make decisions about how they move. All right, oops, I'm almost knocking this over. Okay. Next slide, and I'm going to check the time. Okay, we're already at 9:30, so that's going to go off in a moment. Okay, so pain science facts. Pathology or joint damage, which shows up through imaging, doesn't correlate well with pain. Acute pain will generally correlate better than persistent pain with tissue damage. And there's a little asterisk here because there's a research study that I have here. And this is all information from the pain science chapter of my book. So this research is actually cited in the reference section in the back of my book. And there's way more research than just this one study, but this one directly correlates to that statement. So gradually introducing and progressing movements that don't cause pain can reduce the experience of pain over time. That's a big, long, fancy way of saying exactly what should happen when you go to physical therapists and work with a really good physical therapist. The problem is we usually, as movement teachers, end up doing what a physical therapist would normally do, at least here in the States, because it takes for tissue change often 12 to 14 months to heal. And we're just not allotted that many physical therapy sessions. So people run out of their PT sessions. They come to, someone like me for private sessions. And I'm basically doing that. I am gradually introducing movement from the smallest, easiest thing up more and more. Thank you so much for doing that because I can't remember to do it. It's too much for my brain over time. And that's where we can really help. Let me make sure. Okay, I skipped something. Okay. And so that's where we really come in and can help. And I talked about graded exposure yesterday. Deep breaths. Okay. So I'm going back because I skipped a slide. And I'm trying to get this out of the way so I can read it. All right. So why is it important for yoga teachers to understand pain science? Some conditions will have a list of contraindications, and students should consult a physical therapist to find out if there are certain movements that they should avoid. However, and there's a big however. So again, scope of practice, but make sure that you know this however. what is appropriate, because PTs know this, physical therapists know this, what is appropriate for each student will change depending on where they are in their treatment cycle. So like I said, if that treatment cycle of tissue healing and adaptation is 12 to 15 months, sometimes 18 months, those numbers come from Robert Schleip. And a condition doesn't necessarily mean that specific movements will result in more pain or are unsafe. So a perfect example, and if you want to flip it so that I'm going to talk for a moment. Thank you. So an example, when I started with Sean Hampton, I was in pain in 4-point kneeling. I could not do hands and knees because my wrists hurt. And that's a pretty low level movement, but I know that that's very common because we don't load our wrists, or we do, right? But we load them in the extreme, say for an hour-long yoga class, but in no other way or fashion with graded exposure and progressive load. So, but now, however many years later, I can do 10 solid, strong push-ups. I can do wild thing and side plank, and I have no pain whatsoever. So how I got from A to B was through something called the SAID principle. And the SAID principle is SAID, and that stands for specific adaptation to imposed demand. And it is like the very first thing you will learn in Exercise Science 101. And all that means is you're only going to be able to do the things that you do regularly. So if you don't load your wrists, it's going to hurt to load your wrists. If you don't strengthen your shoulders, it's going to hurt to load your wrists. If you don't load your shoulders, you won't be able to load your wrists without pain. And the way that happens is through something called progressive loading. So if I had been told, don't do hands and knees because it causes pain, I would never be where I am today because it would skip the whole progressive loading phase that's required in order to get out of pain and to heal. So, you know, when there is a diagnosis, so say, for example, I have many clients with scoliosis. Each client has different lifestyle, has different types of movement and exercise they do outside of their session with me, is a different age, has a different curve. And so just because they have the diagnosis scoliosis doesn't mean that there are things that across the board apply as contraindications, because they're all different people with different ages, with different lifestyles, with different movement patterns and loading histories and different shaped curves. So I think that's a reason why it's really important. I know I brought into this pain science a lot of biomechanics in this moment, but this is where I will direct you to Gregory Lehman again. He has a course called Reconciling Biomechanics with Pain Science. If you go on the internet, you will see the pain science tribe over here and the biomechanics tribe over there, and how, just like if you're an American, there's Democrats and Republicans, and often it's just a lot of fighting. But really there's a middle ground. And I think Greg Lehman is brilliant at teaching lay people and professionals and clinicians how it's never all one or the other. It's a combination of both. They both matter, and they're both really important to understand. Okay, so I'm going to go back to share screen, and that's going to bring us to the next slide. So pain science tells us that a basic function of pain is to protect the body. If you've ever accidentally put your hand on a hot stove and pulled your hand away, you know how that works. The brain might consider moving quickly or with increased effort as inherently dangerous for the muscles and joints. So a perfect example of this would be taking a HIIT class. So a HIIT class is HIIT. It stands for high intensity interval training. If you've ever taken a HIIT class, you know what I'm talking about. You do a lot of burpees and jumping and, just ballistic high level movements. And if you haven't trained to adapt to that, your brain is going to be like, oh my gosh, like I haven't jumped on a hard surface in a long time. This is dangerous. That's a good thing that your brain is telling you that. And that's part of why for folks who are in pain, somatics is a really good place to start. You wouldn't start with a high intensity interval training class. You would start moving slowly and mindfully with reduced force, load, and effort. Like these things we're doing that are on the ground and really slow and small. And then that can demonstrate to the brain that a movement is safe. And then maybe you're able to do it in a more gravity loaded position. All right, another theory of modern pain science is that we perceive pain in accordance with something called the virtual body or brain mapping. And sometimes parts of this map can get smudged as a result of inactivity. So I'm gonna try not to go off on too much of a tangent, but if we go back to the story of me and my jaw, my TMJD and my shoulder pain and my carpal tunnel and not being able to load my wrists, what that is about is, sorry, let me make sure I can see the PowerPoint. Where we are, slowly and mindfully. Okay, yes. So I wasn't moving or loading those areas of my body because I was in pain. And so my map was smudged and I couldn't differentiate. Like my shoulder was just, all over the place. I couldn't tell when I was protracting or retracting, when I was elevating, depressing, or I could, but it was just so, like slippery and slidey in there. And I couldn't map it well in my brain. And so when this also happens, if you've heard of, when people used to get their hip replaced, they would have them afterwards lie in bed and not get up or load for a long time. And now the first thing they do after their hip is replaced is get them up and walking as soon as possible. And this has to do with many things, but one of them is the smudging. So not losing that brain connection to your body and getting the progressive loading happening as soon as possible. So somatics is a really nice way to help people get the proprioception back that they have lost through inactivity and through that smudging. And here I have a little asterisk after. This can cause the brain to create pain to warn and protect us from perceived danger, regardless of whether it exists. And that comes directly from Greg Lehman's Pain Science Workbook, that free download that I put the link to in the chat box. All right, so this is going to take us to the next slide. All right, so more on how somatics can reduce tension and pain. So another theory of modern pain science is that, oh, nope, we already did that. Okay, somatics introduces movement variability. And variability is a principle that comes from exercise science. It's really, really important to helping prevent repetitive stress injuries. So, for example, one of the reasons why I had carpal tunnel is because I was clicking a mouse 8 to 9 hours a day. And that's a repetitive movement that is pretty hard to get your body to adapt to. And so a lot of times though, we do that to ourselves with our exercise. We pick one kind of exercise we like and we do it as our only thing. And so often getting out of pain is just introducing variability into your movement practice. And that is one of the main tenets of somatics. So as I have here, somatics introduces movement variability, which can be beneficial for improving proprioception and reducing discomfort in a posture or a position. Little side note here, people always ask, and if you guys want to flip back and forth, I can't handle it. I'll let you guys do it. Yes. So when you see children who wiggle and squirm, and then they are told, sit still and pay attention, that's not normal. That's not natural. When they do that, they're doing that because their body is telling them they've been in a position for too long and they need to shift and adjust. And that's trained out of us in school, and especially as an adult, if you have a desk job. So when your body gives you that message to switch positions, you should switch positions. And go back. All right. Because so when we're constantly shifting the positions when we're doing somatics, the part of the body that receives mechanical stress in a movement or posture is constantly shifting. Perfect example would be those palm slides, how we did the palm slides in the pre-recorded session. Upward rotation, straight out to the side, downward rotation. You're constantly shifting and drawing awareness to the sensations that those shifts create. And these minor changes in angles can create a sense of relief, because a part of the body that might not always experience work is engaged. So for example, say with shoulder blades, right? If a student comes to you and they never lift their arms higher than their shoulders, and then suddenly they are in a yoga class with down dog, which is arms overhead, which requires upward rotation and elevation of the shoulder blades. Doing the palm slides in that position, if they're kind of locked down in downward rotation, or just like have some smudging and they can't connect to upward rotation of the scapula in a loaded position like down dog, doing the palm slides at that upward diagonal at the very beginning of class can be really helpful. All right. Yes, so different areas can stretch or relax, and other areas can experience work and engage. Okay, make sure I am on track. Okay, variability. I'm just cross-referencing my paper with the screen to make sure I don't skip anything. Okay. So the goal in somatics is not to do an exercise with a clearly defined optimal form, but to practice a basic movement in many different ways. And this is just another way of talking about variability. When we give people options and choices, because everyone's different, they can discover for themselves what position is best. And I just want to make sure I don't forget to talk about Todd Hargrove. I know I wrote his name down, and it must have been on a previous slide. Double check. Yes, it was. Okay. So Todd Hargrove, and I'm going to actually ask you if you can type that for me. Going back and forth is hard. So it's T-O-D-D, Todd, and then last name Hargrove, H-A-R-G-R-O-V-E. And I interviewed him for my book. Todd is, and I know I'm talking, so you want to flip it. Todd is trained as a lawyer, and he then got certified as a Rolfer, and then he did the Feldenkrais practitioner training, all 4 years of it, I believe, is how long the whole thing is. And it's around, I think, $20,000 to $30,000 to do the full Feldenkrais training. And he's written tons of blogs and 2 books. And so I pulled them out so just so I can show you, because I highly recommend them both. Let me get them both out. All right. So this is the first one I recommend getting, and it is called A Guide to Better Movement. And he is just incredible. There's sequences in the back, but he is a brilliant educator. he reminds me of Katie Bowman in a lot of ways, in the sense that he can articulate complicated concepts in a very simple and easy to understand way. So highly recommend this book. This is his first book. And then the second book is called Playing with Movement. And I recommend this one a lot as well. Yes, so just wanted to make sure. Let me double check in my notes if there was a link. Yes, there it is. I will copy paste. Let's see. And chat box here. Okay, there we go. There's the link to get that book. All right, and then I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, and this is making me appreciate teaching in person, because the screen just stays up. I don't have to click. It's all a good, it's good stress. Okay, so here we are. I'm orienting. We are on to the next slide. Oop, sometimes it clicks twice. Okay, example of variability, spinal rotation. So we have 24 different vertebrae that can rotate when we move. And if each of those vertebrae participates in a small amount of rotational movement, then rotation will feel easier to do. However, if one vertebra moves a lot, and say 5 in a row move very little, then rotation might not feel so good. And so when you're practicing a Feldenkrais or somatic exercise, you would be invited to turn your attention to the 5 vertebrae that were limited in mobility. And because these movements are so slow and you're lying on the ground, there's time to do that. And oftentimes there's feedback from the floor, or there's a constraint that helps you tap into that proprioception and awareness of the vertebrae that are maybe more limited in mobility. Whereas in yoga, the emphasis is often on moving deeper into a pose. So a lot of the twists we do are just finding our end ranges of motion in rotation right away. Rather than noticing like these vertebrae are involved or these aren't. And that's not always the case. So we are going to do a sequence, and I'm looking at the time. We have 10 minutes left, which means then we wouldn't get through the PowerPoint. So I'm going to skip the sequence and keep going with the PowerPoint, but it's a sequence that's also rotation and in a similar vein to the palm slides. And it's called supine prayer palms with crossed legs. But I think to give it its proper due, I always I always put more content in so I don't run out. But yeah, this one would deserve like a good 20 minutes, which we don't have. So we're going to go right into somatics versus yoga. How are they different? And let me share my screen. All right. And then this should be, okay. So in somatics, attention is directed towards the internal experience instead of alignment or aesthetics. So internal experience meaning interoception, and then of course, proprioception. Somatic exercise movements are slow and subtle, and they're made with the intention to generate sensory information and then attend to that information in a mindful way. So that's why so many of the cues are questions, is notice what you notice and then decide, do you want to keep reaching further away or maybe make it smaller? Do you want to put your foot here or do you want to put your foot there? And this is beneficial for enhancing proprioception and creating movement variability. And this is different from a typical modern postural yoga class where there's often an intention to create a specific alignment within a pose and to have a sense of working hard, right? So finding the effort and the ease, but folks know the shape of that pose in their mind visually, which is very different from a somatic movement. Okay, so how are they? Ooh, sometimes when I hit things, it goes fast. Okay, I'm gonna go to my paper so I don't lose track. All right, so yoga asana revolves heavily on something called the stretch reflex. And most people we know come to yoga for stretching. That's just kind of the way it is. They want to get more flexible. And that stretch reflex mechanism is different from the pandiculation techniques that appear in many of the somatic schools of thought. So, as I said, many students come to yoga with the desire to become more flexible or to reduce muscle tension. And one reason why yoga might help them become more flexible is because of how the stretch reflex works. And so we're going to get a little sciencey, but not too sciencey here. I'm going to say right here and now that if you want to go super deep dive on all of this stuff, my dear friend and colleague, Jules Mitchell, she wrote the foreword, one of the forewords for my book, has a book called, and she's on Yoga International, so you can study with her there. It is called Yoga Biomechanics, Stretching Redefined. She did her whole master's degree and her entire thesis on this topic. I've taken almost everything she offers, continuing education-wise, and it's all phenomenal. But she is the scientist. I learned from her. So yeah, if you want to deep dive, definitely on this, go to Jules. But I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version. So coming back to the PowerPoint, share screen, and then back. Okay. Yes, so primary reason, we got that. Okay. There's many different proprioceptors in the human body, and they help us track where our joints are in space. And there's two that correlate strongly to the stretch reflex. One of them is the muscle spindle, and the other is the Golgi tendon organ, and you might have heard it referred to as GTO. So the muscle spindle is a stretch receptor found in the belly of skeletal muscles, and it senses the amount and speed of stretch being placed on a muscle. And so when the muscle spindle is stimulated, it may cause the muscle that is being stretched to relax and inhibit the opposing muscle group from contracting, right? We've probably had that experience when stretching. And so the role of the muscle spindle is to regulate muscle tone and prevent you from moving too quickly or deeply into a range of motion that could result in injury. We have it there for a reason. It tells you like, oh, you're stretching. This is a stretch. Maybe stay here. Don't go any further. This is enough. Or no, you can go further. We get these messages. When we move into a stretch, when we're practicing a yoga pose and we sense the resistance or an endpoint, and that may be the muscle spindle sending a signal to the spinal column, indicating we shouldn't move any deeper into a stretch. Okay, what is the Golgi tendon organ? So the GTO, or Golgi tendon organ, is a stretch inhibitor located where skeletal muscle and tendons join. And it senses the amount of tension being placed on a muscle. So I always think of the GTO as like this little, I don't know, cartoon character, and like you're in your hamstring stretch and, you know, you're got the strap around your foot, and like say you know, the GTO, it gets activated. Oops, sorry, let's go back to the slide. Because I'm looking at what time it is. So share screen, sorry about that. So if too much tension is placed on the tendon, the GTO is going to inhibit muscle spindle activity, which will cause the muscle to lengthen or relax to prevent injury, meaning the GTO is going to be like, hey, go slack now. And then you get more stretch. Okay. Okay, I said that one. activated, too much tension. Okay, I believe we are here. No, I think we did that one. Okay. Sorry, I am losing track of where we are. I think it's right here. Okay, is this where we are? Did I talk about this slide? Yes, I think I did. Okay. All right. Many students come to yoga with the desire to become more flexible or to reduce muscle tension, as I mentioned earlier. And a primary reason why yoga might improve flexibility is because of how the stretch reflex works. But for some students who still experience restrictions, somatics can be a beneficial complement to yoga. And this is because somatics relies on a different mechanism to reduce muscle tension, and in turn can help them increase their range of motion available during movement, but in a different way. And then we talked about this yesterday. That technique or that way is pandiculation. And that's using your body against gravitational forces to facilitate neuromuscular re-education. So different from, say, holding a passive stretch with a strap around your foot type of thing that we typically do a lot of in yoga, and tensing muscles. And then as a quick review, those 3 phases of pandiculation is phase 1, selecting an anatomical focus or an area to engage or contract. Phase 2, gradually relaxing that muscle group until you've explored the full range of motion of relaxation. And then step 3 is pausing to allow your nervous system to fully process and integrate the experience. All right. And the pandiculation is different from yoga asana because in addition to the somatic movements being much smaller, that's to remind me I should be finished. So I'm going to wrap it up. There's conscious contraction. There's a conscious contraction of the muscle with moments of pause to sense the changes that take place in the body. Okay, yes. And so how this relates to pain and our sense of danger, it's in these conscious movements and specific areas of the body combined with the moments of pause, rather than just moving on to the next flow and the next thing, are a form of body mapping. And so that body mapping, that time to do the body mapping can improve proprioception and hopefully reduce the experience of pain or danger that your nervous system is sensing around that joint or multiple joints. All right, let me look at my paper ahead to see how much more we have left, how behind I am. Turning perception. Okay. So proprioception is the subconscious ability to sense where the joints and limbs are in space without visual feedback through the input of sensory nerve endings located in muscles, tendons, and joints. And then this is just a big takeaway. You can even write in your notes if you want. An arrow up saying increase proprioception, and then an arrow down leads to decreased pain or joint discomfort. So when someone asks me what I teach, because it's hard to say, I teach yoga, I teach Pilates, I'm a movement educator. What I really want to just say is I teach proprioception, but general public doesn't really know what that word means. But I think that if we can teach proprioception, we can help people get out of pain once they've been to a clinician and gone through the scope of practice of, addressing their needs with a physical therapist. All right, sensory nerve endings detect changes in joint angle, muscle tension, pressure, and speed of movement and send this information to the brain, triggering protective reflexes to stop or slow movements to prevent injury. All right. So since so many of these somatic sequences involve movements that are lying on the floor, that helps increase proprioception because you're not dealing with gravity, you're relaxed, and you've got feedback from the ground. It helps us to understand where our joints are in space. And this can be particularly helpful for areas like the shoulder blades or the spine, the back of the body, which most people have trouble mapping because we can't see it. Sometimes we can't even reach around to touch it or feel it, depending on range of motion, and thus we have less awareness. And isn't it interesting that, you know, so many people have pain in their shoulders or in their spine or back? Okay. That is done. All right, let me make sure I'm not missing. So yes, we're almost done. All right, lying on a hard floor is a novel experience for the average person. So, you know, somebody like me, I'm a weirdo. I read Katie Bowman's book about how lying on or sleeping on the floor can be a replacement for having to roll on balls and do myofascial release. And I'm like, cool, I'm gonna sleep on the floor. And then I sleep on the floor for, you know, years. Not everyone is weird like me. It did, by the way, actually help get rid of some back pain that I had. And it doesn't mean it's going to work for everyone. But so when somebody is used to only being on a soft couch or a bed or a squishy mat, it's harder for them to propriocept and feel because they're not getting the same kind of feedback they would get from the hard floor. And I realize not everyone, you know, there's again that graded exposure and the adaptation to the load of the hard floor that needs to happen over time. Which I think is most easily conducted in a private session. But yes, it's just a really nice thing to do. Constructive rest is a great place to start. Lie on your back with your knees bent and your feet on the floor to help your students map their back body. So let's experience this in real time, body scan with scapular awareness. But I did a lot of body scans in the pre-recorded, and I'll be doing more in these movement sessions. So I'm going to skip that because I know you guys, you all have access to quite a few body scans already. Okay, so that I'm going to stop share. Okay, and we are going to move right into our movement class. And the theme for today's movement class, if you want to, so I'll talk first about the pre-recorded sequence that's called side bending and side lying with somatics. And there were, hopefully you had a chance to maybe do them. If not, no worries. But there were 3 side bending sequences. The first one was lying on your side. The second one was lying on your back. And then the third one was going from your back and then balancing on your side. That third one comes from Bartenieff. The first one comes from Hanna Somatics. Actually, the first 2. And, you know, there's a lot of blur between Hanna Somatics and Feldenkrais because Thomas Hanna studied with Feldenkrais, but just to orient you. And so what you could do, I'm going to teach a class that's focused on the lateral line and has a somatic feel to it, even when we're doing yoga asana. And I'm choosing sequence 3 as our somatic sequence or our check recheck, but you could teach this exact same class and choose sequence 1 or 2 instead. And then also huge shout out to Kylie. I have, let's see, so I linked to further resources. She is on Yoga International and she has, let's see. Oh, okay. So for this sequence, I put 2 references. Number 1, the Rise Up Back Bend practice with my friend and colleague, Rocky Heron. Oh, sorry, nope, I'm looking at the wrong thing. That's why. This is for later today. Grab the one that's for, I thought I messed that up. Okay, no, Rocky is for later as the inspiration. This was yesterday. Opening. Got so many of these little things. I can't keep track of them all. Okay. If you noticed, I was a lot calmer yesterday. I'll be totally honest, I'm not a morning person. So this getting up at 6 and doing this at 8:30 is a challenge, but that's okay. Okay, I've got it in my hands. So this is the lateral line flow class outline. And at the very end of it, I have additional practice. Yoga with Kylie, Spirals and Rebound 2. And that is in the Yoga International Community Classes section. There's a link to that. She is brilliant at sequencing, and I think sequencing in a way that is very somatically inspired. So I encourage you to check out her work, because this flow we're going to do today is inspired by a class I took with her. Okay, so we are going to get started. And as far as props go for this class, the first part is going to be on the bare floor, because we'll be doing a little bit of sliding. And then I recommend having a mat. I think it'll be nice to have 2 blocks, so you have the option to use them if you want to. And if you want to have a blanket, that might be nice too. So 2 blocks and a blanket, hard floor option, and then the mat. And we will get started.